And here we go. Time to get serious. I mean, really serious about it. Social psychologists took on the question, and I talked about social psychologists being enlisted to use their persuasive abilities to help us enter the war. But post-World War II was probably even more important to social psychology than prior to and during World War II. Because once we discovered the horror of the Holocaust, once we discovered 6 million people had been murdered simply because they were Jewish, another couple 100,000 people were murdered simply because they were Romas, because they were gypsies. Another 100, 200,000 people were murdered because they were homosexuals. So anyone who didn't fit the German ideal was up for potential murder. How do you make that happen? How do you get a group of people, right, German people, and how do you convince them that they need to murder others based on their category membership? Well, is it possible that ordinary men and women could be convinced to kill so many civilians? Or did we just cherry pick out the sadists to do the killing? And it turns out that no, it was pretty much accepted that it was ordinary men doing the killing. There's a book by Browning, Ordinary Men, the Police Reserve Battalion 101, talks about the time in Poland and gives us a really good look at how this mechanism works. Stanley Milgram's going to take another approach. Is it something about their personality or culture? Milgram didn't think so. He thought that, man, the power of the situation can cause this level of killing. The big question is, how do I demonstrate it in the laboratory? Were the German people simply more obedient? No, not so much. Personality explanations are not going to really rock our world in this regard. We need to look at the power of the situation. So, Milgram sets it up and he says, what is my paradigm? That is my research method. I'm going to bring people into the laboratory at Yale University and I'm going to tell people, hey, we believe that punishment will in fact increase learning ability. So that's the setup, and what we're going to do is the teacher is going to read a list of words and then they're going to read another list of words, and the learner then has to indicate which word from the previous list was on the second list, right? Simple paradigm like that. What we really need is we just need a teacher and a learner, and every time that the learner is incorrect, the teacher will deliver an electrical shock. Supposedly, this will facilitate the learning process on future trials. So, that's the setup, right? Well, Milgram says, I don't want college students, because college students are pretty compliant. College students, I'm sorry guys, but it's true. You're used to kind of getting pushed around by your teachers, for better or for worse. He said, I want people who are out in the community. I want people, not young adults, but I want, middle-aged adults for the most part in my experiment. And, people who've been out, not in the academic world, but the real world, if you'll live with my stereotypes here. So he advertises in the newspaper, and that's where he recruits his participants. So you got ordinary men, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, right? From the New Haven, Connecticut environment. And they come in to participate in this experiment. I think they get paid like $5, which back then was decent bank. So people come in and they think they're helping Yale University with this study and learning, etc. There's all this component around it. And you're told now, because you come in from the community, you're told, hey, here's a participant, you guys draw this piece of paper out of the hat and it'll assign you to your role. Well, the participant draws out of the hat, and there's 2 slips of paper in there, and they both say teacher, so it's already predetermined that the participant is the teacher, the Confederate is the learner. And each time the learner misses an answer, right, you're, as the teacher, going to deliver an electrical shock, right, to, in fact, make them learn better, I guess is the premise. So this is Milgram's study. It's absolutely brilliant. It's amazing. And this is an actual picture of what's going on. So we have the learner being hooked up to the shock apparatus. This guy is our teacher, right? And the guy in the lab coat is the one who's running the show. He's called the experimenter. And then you have an amazing prop that's built, and this really kind of sells the whole thing. This thing looks like it will do what it's supposed to do, that is deliver shocks. Each one of these switches is incremented at 15 volts. So let's take the switch numbers. Number 1 is 15 volts, number 2 is 30 volts, number 3 is 45 volts, all the way on to switch number 30 is 450 volts. Notice the labels that you can't read say slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, danger, warning, Will Robinson, severe shock, and then triple X, which was the universal sign for danger and poison before the world was taken over by pornography, and triple X gained a new meaning. So that's a diagram of the control panel. Here's the deal. Every time the learner is wrong, and this is scripted, then it says, please deliver the shock. I deliver a 15 volt shock, and I hear from the other room where the participant is located. Made it easier to do the experiment if the teacher and the learner were apart. That's a variation that will be tested later on. But so I shock them, right? And then we go about the experiment. They do something wrong, and then I have to deliver another shock as a teacher, but now I have to move up one notch. Always one notch. I have to increment. Remember that word? I have to increment the shocks. So no one is going to come into the experiment and zap someone with 450 volts on the first round. Well, maybe there's a handful of sadists out there, but that's not what we're looking at. We want to see the behavior of ordinary men and later ordinary women. So 15 volts at a time. Now, the teacher was actually exposed to a 75 volt shock at the beginning of the experiment so they would know what it's about. Notice, this allows things to get started because, hey, I took 75 volts. Man, giving him a 45 volt shock won't hurt him. I already took 75 volts, right? So it's all good. 15 volts at a time. What do we observe? Well, at 330 volts, the learner no longer responds. They've been complaining about having a heart condition, and they got to get out of there, but the experiment must continue. And so after 330 volts, the learner never responds. The teacher is told a non-response is the same as a wrong answer. Shock them 15 volts up at a time. So essentially they were shocking a dead or unconscious person at that point in time. If the teacher didn't want to continue, and you can imagine many of us would say, no, I don't want to shock. We got to stop this shocking. This is not right. This is wrong. The experimenter, that guy in the lab coat, was allowed to use 4 things, so it was heavily scripted. His persuasive messages, that is, to get the teacher to continue shocking, please continue. And if the teacher says, no, I don't want to continue, then the experimenter could up the persuasive message. The experiment requires that you continue. No, I'm not going to continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue, right? And then finally, the last one, you have no other choice, you must go on. Now, that's a powerful one. And one thing that tends to release people from the experience of cognitive dissonance is believing they don't have a choice. Now, Milgram and Festinger are working on Festinger on cognitive dissonance, Milgram on obedience to authority at about the same time. So I don't know that they were able to inform each other, but it's kind of an interesting irony that these things were happening at the same time. Obedience to authority, what do we observe in Milgram's experiment? Well, escalation of violence was observed. That is, people went up to 15 volts, right? The actual coercion that the experimenter was allowed to use was tightly controlled. The controversial experiment demonstrated how powerful the effects of obedience to authority. Because remember, this is authority. This is Yale University. In New Haven, Connecticut, you look at Yale and say, oh my God, that's where all those crazy experiments go on. That's where the true knowledge and learning is. So, what do we know? Well, we know that Milgram conducted, like Ash, maybe about 17 different versions of this experiment, manipulating small aspects to see how they mattered. Let us start with the initial study. That is our baseline. And Milgram was shocked. Figuratively, not literally. that 65% of the 20 male participants went all the way to 450 volts. 2/3 of them went all the way. Now, it still means a third didn't. A third jumped off at some point in time and stopped, right? But so Milgram starts asking questions like, well, I wonder if it's because it's Yale. Maybe that had an impact. So what does he do? He moves the experiment. He reruns the experiment with new participants at an office building he rents in New Haven, Connecticut. Now, under that circumstance, notice that the compliance rate dropped to 48%. So setting matters, at least in this experiment, but it's something we should consider, right? When the teacher and learner were placed together, that is, in the same room, we see compliance drops all the way down to 40% from 65%. Okay? When the teacher touches the learner, that is, actually has to hold their hand down on a shock apparatus, then only 30% of the teachers comply, 70% leave at some point. Right? When the teacher and the experimenter are no longer together, that is, the experimenter says, well, now you know what to do. If you have any problems, call me. Here's a phone. Then the experimenter could give the 4 statements, please continue, it's essential, you must go on, etc., over the phone. But notice their impact drops drastically. Now we're only getting 22% compliance. Think about it. We talked earlier in the lecture about compliance, and if you gain compliance through coercion, you need to be there. As soon as you're not there, then compliance drops off substantially. Okay? Now, non-professor in charge, that way we don't have the guy in the lab coat anymore. We have another guy who's pretending to be a participant who's just assigned to the role to be in charge. We see it drop to 20%, and here is the dissenter, the magic of the dissenter. And now we got all kinds of people in the room by, variation 16 on this experiment. You got 2 people who say, this is bullshit, we're out of here. Then we only find 10% of the teachers going all the way to 450 volts. This is an amazing experiment. And when you look at the Ash experiment and you look at the Milgram experiment, in this era, late 50s, early 60s, social psychology is operating on all 8 cylinders, man. They are kicking out some amazing studies. Ethics, maybe questionable. Internal review boards don't exist. But we see some powerful discoveries at this point in time. Bottom line, ordinary men and women can be compelled to do horrible things towards other people. It's not that difficult to make happen. And it's happened time and time and time and time and time and time again. Okay. So, factors in blind obedience then? Well, propaganda helps. So you gotta start talking about people, and a lot of times propaganda of this nature is dehumanizing the victims. So the Jews are vermin, or people from South and Central America are coming up here to rape us, or we got to create some kind of propaganda that sets these people apart, somehow legitimizes our response towards them. We socialize it, so we make it part of everyday living. Identity creation or fusion, and so we create an identity, right, and people then fuse with the identity. People are called, as Trump ascended into the presidency, right, it was Make America Great Again, so that's MAGA, and people started calling themselves MAGA, so a MAGA identity was created, and then people fuse with that powerful identity, right? So now, it could be Jonestown, it could be Manson's followers, it could be Hitler and the Nazis. Being a Nazi was a good thing, a member of the Nazi party, that was to be desired, right? So there's a fusion from the people to the authoritarian leader, okay? The perception of the authority as being legitimate, and we see a man in a lab coat at Yale fits that bill, right? Foot in the door is another technique, right? It's just a single shock. It's just a 15-volt shock. Once we get someone to give a 15-volt shock, we got our foot in the door. Let's move it up to a 30-volt shock. Or in the case of Nazi Germany, once we stop shopping at Jewish businesses, isn't it okay if we taunt Jews publicly? Or maybe engage in violence towards those Jews? Eventually on Kristallnacht, set their businesses and synagogues afire? And loot their property, so it's this. kind of incremental approach. Values become relative, right? And values become differentiated. Yeah, it's wrong to take the life of a human being, but it's not wrong to take the life of a subhuman. And if you convince people that the Jews are subhuman, then you've opened the door to doing this. And then sunk costs. In for a penny, in for a pound is the old saying. Once we got people knee-deep in the mess, they're generally willing to continue on in that same mess. So from obedience to action, what else do we need to do maybe to kind of grease the wheels of this process? Well, we de-individuate. So we start robbing people of their individuality or convincing them to shed their individuality to embrace their group membership. So it's the merging of the self with the group leader. And this is kind of this fascistic or cult-like process. This helps people detach from their personal values and adopt the group values. So while I might have a personal value against killing people, as I begin to merge with this group and the group value is some death is just necessary, then I'm more inclined to embrace or adopt that value. And then diffusion of responsibility. We create an anonymity so that I can't be tracked. This is another way to do it. Or I can't be identified as a perpetrator of this. Or maybe I'm anonymous because everybody is doing it. And that we've gotten a certain critical mass of people. And then this then leads to lack of accountability. And once the accountability structure dissolves, then all bets are off. So, what we've done essentially at this point is we've moved from the idea of persuasion and the various forms of persuasion. We've talked about power and how that kind of interfaces with persuasion. We've talked about group membership and how it can facilitate this process, right? So I've grouped this all as a package because I believe that it all is interconnected, right? And it's all useful. So if you want to become a cult leader, if you want to dominate people in the world, you've had a hell of a primer to be able to do that. I'm hoping, though, that this has greater appeal to those of us who want to be in the world, who want to be authentic, and who want to resist the pressures that might use us as tools for their agendas. So, let's solicit some help, and I hope you guys know these two guys. Maybe you don't. If you've had social psychology, you had a chapter on altruism or helping behavior, however it was titled. It's changed over the years. And Darley and Latney, and I love this picture of the two of them, but let's look at them. There they are. And they did a lot of research based on kind of prompted by the murder of Kitty Genovese, where no one bothered to even call the police as a woman was being brutally stabbed in New York. And it led them on a path to understanding why people help or why they don't. What factors might increase the likelihood that we help? What factors diminish the likelihood that we would help? And they gave us kind of a laundry list, the bystander effect, and that is the more people that are present, the less likely any one of those people will step up and help. So more people does not increase the probability of being helped. In fact, it diminishes the possibility of help. And they did a whole bunch of huge experiments about this. They're nicely recounted in a popular press book called The Unresponsive Bystander, Why Doesn't He Help? That was on sale, really designed for the general public, talking about their research in a non-research kind of parlance. Pluralistic ignorance. Sometimes we don't help because we don't know that help is necessary. We're in a situation of uncertainty. We look around, we see nobody else helping, so we take that as a cue that we don't need to help. Obviously, we're sharing our ignorance, pluralistic ignorance. Diffusion of responsibility. I might believe that it's not my responsibility to help, so I just put the responsibility of helping onto somebody else. Maybe I'm under time pressure and I don't help because I'm in a hurry. God, I can't miss this job interview to help that person because I will be late and I won't get the job. It might be lack of competence. I'd help, but I just don't know how to. Or it might be a cost-benefit analysis. That is, I look and I say, helping might be dangerous, and I'm not willing to take on that danger, besides what's in it for me. So might be dangerous, So, helping solutions, be direct. If you need help, point to a specific individual, say, please call 911. You point to another individual and you say, please get something that can be used as a bandage. You don't just scream out, help, because people won't know what to do. So when the chips are down and help is needed, you got to put your leadership britches on. You got to look directly at people and inform them, direct them specifically what to do. And you'll get usually pretty damn good compliance. So be direct, be specific. That's the key to engineering. Point to a specific person, make a specific request, do it, right? And that's about it. Now, that's a very narrow view of helping behavior, right? That's a whole lecture in 2 slides. But again, notice, it's about power and it's about compliance. You want people to comply. So if you want people to comply in a helping situation, those are the 2 key elements. Be direct, be specific. And I want you guys to say goodbye to Mama. There she is, Mama in all her splendor. We were really worried about Mama. She lost weight. She shed 2-3 pounds. She was looking horrible. She was looking next to death. And we've seen this in kind of some of our older cats, 12, 13 years old. Mama is. I'm not even sure. We did some tests. It wasn't looking good. But the vet, we discussed. We tried a couple things, and believe it or not, Mama is looking great. She's gained back 3 pounds, and she's just this kind of crazy ass cat. So there you go, Mama. We looked for help, we got help, and Mama's the beneficiary of that help. So rock on, Mama. You guys rock on too. I hope you have a good day.